Hello, my name is Daniel. Thank you for being here with me today. If you enjoy real, heartbreaking cheating stories from Reddit, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and leave a comment to share your thoughts. It really means a lot to me. This is a story that's been haunting me ever since I read it. It's about betrayal, disappointment, and the crushing realization that sometimes the people we love most can become strangers before our eyes. The story comes from a man named Adrian, a 33-year-old living in Portland, Oregon. He shared that his best friend, Ethan, who is 35, had betrayed him in a way he never expected. For over 10 years, they had been inseparable, practically brothers. They had lived together for nearly half that time, supporting each other through hardships, losses, and even family tragedies. Adrian thought he knew Ethan's character inside and out. He believed they shared the same values, especially when it came to relationships and loyalty. But everything collapsed when Ethan became involved in helping a young woman named Lily, only 25, cheat on the father of her 1-year-old daughter. For Adrian, this wasn't just some casual mistake or lapse in judgment. Cheating wasn't a gray area for him. His own childhood had been scarred by it, when his mother's affair tore the family apart. He knew the devastation it caused, the hollow pain of broken trust. That pain shaped his moral compass, and Ethan knew exactly how strongly he felt. Yet despite that, Ethan pursued Lily while she was still in a relationship, going as far as bringing her into Adrian's home, turning his safe space into a backdrop for their affair. Adrian had made it clear that his home was not to be used for such things. He begged Ethan to respect his boundaries, but it didn't matter. Ethan ignored his words, brushed off his objections, and excused his behavior at every turn. To make matters worse, Ethan wasn't some distant acquaintance. He rented a room in Adrian's condo, which meant Adrian had to see him daily, forced to watch his friend defend something that shattered his own values. The betrayal cut so deeply that Adrian found himself drinking heavily just to endure Ethan's presence. He admitted that he couldn't even tolerate being around him unless the buzz of alcohol dulled the disgust and anger burning inside. He knew it was unhealthy, but the bitterness in his chest wouldn't let him rest. He couldn't recognize Ethan anymore. The man he thought was his brother had become someone completely foreign. The weight of it all left Adrian torn. On one hand, there was a decade of friendship, years of shared memories, and countless nights spent building each other up. On the other, there was this betrayal, this absolute disregard for something Adrian considered sacred. He didn't know if the friendship could ever be salvaged, or if he even wanted to salvage it. When asked by others online, Adrian confessed more. Yes, Ethan had knowingly pursued Lily while she was still attached to the father of her child. Yes, he had brought the affair into Adrian's home before the breakup ever happened. And yes, they had been so close that Adrian once thought of Ethan as family. But now, family was the very thing that felt destroyed. As if the timing weren't cruel enough, everything came to a breaking point on the first anniversary of Adrian's father's death. On a day already heavy with grief, Ethan's indifference and cruelty finally became unbearable. Adrian kicked him out, cutting off all contact. The silence after was painful, but also strangely freeing. In the weeks that followed, Adrian struggled, but he also grew. He put down the bottle, determined not to drown his sorrow in alcohol anymore. He counted the days since his last drink, and each one gave him a little more confidence. He realized that he wasn't as alone as he once thought. Other friends, quieter ones, who had always been there in the background, stepped forward and supported him. Their loyalty contrasted so sharply with Ethan's betrayal that Adrian finally understood what real friendship looked like. He admitted the loss still hurt. A decade of brotherhood doesn't just vanish without leaving scars. But with time, he began to see clearly. He didn't need Ethan's excuses or Lily's lies. He didn't need to cling to something that no longer resembled friendship. What he needed was peace, sobriety, and people who respected his values rather than trampling on them. Stories like this remind us how easily trust can be shattered, how fragile the bonds of friendship can become when tested by betrayal. For Adrian, it wasn't just about cheating. It was about discovering the true character of the man he once called his closest friend. And that discovery, as painful as it was, forced him to walk away. Adrian thought back to Ethan's behavior and realized it wasn't just the affair that revealed who his best friend really was. The truth had always been there, hidden behind small moments that now looked more sinister. Years earlier, during a casual conversation about past relationships, Adrian had mentioned his very first girlfriend. He spoke her name with the kind of nostalgic innocence that comes from remembering a simpler time. Not long after, Ethan tracked her down on social media. Within weeks, Ethan was on a date with her. Adrian remembered how unsettling that felt, how strange and invasive it was. At the time, he brushed it aside, convincing himself that maybe it wasn't as bad as it seemed. But now, looking back, he saw it for what it truly was. A pattern of selfishness, of stepping into places where Ethan never belonged. That memory left Adrian hollow, confirming that maybe he had ignored too many red flags. While he reflected on his own life, he came across another story that echoed themes of betrayal, family tension, and the silent destruction of trust. It was written by a man named Thomas, 36 years old, from Denver, Colorado. His story wasn't about cheating, but it carried the same heaviness of loss and disappointment. Thomas and his wife had gone on vacation for 2 weeks, hoping to escape daily stresses and reconnect, but when they returned home, they found their apartment in ruins, destroyed by none other than Thomas's 75-year-old father, who had been living there rent-free. What greeted them was chaos. Fast food wrappers carpeted the floors of the living room and bedrooms. Dirty shirts, some of which belonged to Thomas himself, were stuffed into the kitchen sink, half soaked in stagnant water. The toilets were clogged. A window had been left open during a rainstorm, allowing water to seep in. And their stove was covered with moldy food. A dozen half-finished coffee cups dotted the apartment like a grim trail of neglect. The laundry was thrown in heaps across the living room, and several appliances, perfectly fine before they left, were now broken. Thomas knew his father had always been messy, but this felt different. It wasn't just sloppiness, it was destruction. This wasn't the first time his father had disrespected the home either. Months earlier, his father had allowed friends to gather there for a pyramid scheme meeting. When Thomas intervened and called the police to remove them, his father turned the blame on him, accusing Thomas of humiliating him in front of his friends. That memory burned as Thomas looked around the wreckage of his home. He wanted to throw his father out. The apartment was in his name after all, and he felt disrespected in every possible way. But his wife hesitated. She reminded Thomas that his father had given them money toward their wedding, and she feared the guilt of asking him to leave if something happened to him. Her compassion clashed with Thomas's exhaustion, leaving the couple stuck in a painful stalemate. Thomas tried to justify what he saw. Maybe his father was just a slob, unwilling to change habits that had followed him for decades. But part of him feared something deeper. He had watched shows about hoarding and cognitive decline, and the signs were all too familiar. Leaving windows open in storms, breaking appliances, failing to complete simple tasks like washing shirts. These weren't just careless acts. They felt like symptoms of something more serious, perhaps even dementia. Others who read his story agreed. Strangers online reminded him the people in the early stages of dementia often appear disrespectful or careless, and loved ones can grow angry before realizing it's not intentional. They urged him to get his father checked out before making decisions he might regret. One commenter said their grandfather had shown the exact same behaviors before being diagnosed, and another pointed out that breaking multiple appliances in 2 weeks wasn't normal by any stretch. It hurt Thomas to consider that possibility, to see his father not just as a stubborn old man, but as someone who might be slipping away piece by piece. If it was dementia, then anger would not fix anything. Compassion would be needed, along with painful choices about assisted living and medical care. Still, standing in his wrecked apartment, Thomas felt the crushing weight of responsibility. He was torn between protecting his own home and well-being or showing endless patience for a man who had never respected his boundaries. The sadness lay in the fact that either choice carried loss. If he pushed his father out, he would carry guilt. If he let him stay, he would keep sacrificing his peace, his marriage, and his sanity. Adrian found himself reading Thomas's words late into the night. The pain of betrayal mirrored in a different form. Whether it was a best friend disregarding moral boundaries or a father destroying his son's home, the theme was the same. Trust once broken leaves behind a silence that no apology can fix. And perhaps the saddest truth was this: sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who leave the deepest scars. Adrian could not shake the heaviness he felt after reading Thomas's story about his father. But what came next hit him in an even more personal place. It was the story of a young woman named Claire, only 25 years old, who had been married less than a year. Her husband, Daniel, was 29, a man who loved his car more than almost anything else. That car had been his pride, his hobby, his comfort. But then a truck driver struck it in a hit-and-run, destroying it beyond repair. No license plate had been recorded, no justice seemed possible. For Daniel, the loss was devastating. Yet what made Claire's heart ache wasn't the car, it was what Daniel became afterward. She wrote that her husband's grief and frustration quickly turned into rage, not directed at the faceless driver who had wrecked his car, but at her. Claire described how he yelled at her endlessly, his voice a constant storm that rattled her every nerve. Whenever she was in his path, he would shove her aside, as if she were nothing more than an obstacle. Once she reached out gently, hoping to calm him by touching his arm. Instead of accepting comfort, he slapped her hand away with a force that startled her to the core. It was the first time he had ever acted like that, and it terrified her. She confessed that she was the kind of person who cried easily whenever someone raised their voice. Now, with Daniel's shouts echoing in their small Denver apartment, she felt cornered, unsure if this was still her husband or a stranger wearing his face. Her question to others was heartbreakingly simple. What could she do to calm him down, to stop the storm? The responses she received were filled with sorrow and alarm. Many told her plainly what she already feared. This wasn't just frustration, it was abuse. A shove, a slap to the hand, raised voices delivered with venom, none of it could be excused as the result of a wrecked car. One commenter reminded her that when a partner crosses the line into aggression even once, the damage done to trust is profound. What happens, they asked, when something worse happens in life? Will he raise his hand again? Will the violence escalate? Others urged Claire to see the truth before it grew darker. They told her to pack a bag and stay somewhere safe, at least until Daniel calmed down. They reminded her that cars can be replaced, but her safety and dignity could not. To place the value of a machine above the well-being of a spouse was a red flag so large it could not be ignored. One person, speaking from personal experience, said that if their own partner had ever shoved them after losing a car, the relationship would have been over on the spot. Another wrote that, less than a year into marriage, Claire had already been treated as an emotional punching bag. That kind of behavior was not a bump in the road, it was the beginning of a dangerous path. The most heartbreaking words came from those who recognized the pattern. They warned that Claire might look back on this moment years later as the first time, the first crack in the foundation, the first incident she let slide, the first time she told herself it was just stress. They begged her not to sweep it under the rug, not to wait for an apology that shifted blame, not to settle for excuses. Adrian read Claire's words with a deep sadness. He remembered his own father, the way his voice thundered during arguments with his mother before the divorce, how the fear in the house hung heavier than the walls could bear. He knew too well that the first time often led to more. And while he admired Claire for speaking up, for reaching out to strangers for guidance, he also felt the ache of knowing she shouldn't have needed to ask. Respect in a marriage was not optional. The story lingered with him long after. It wasn't just about a broken car or an angry outburst. It was about the fragile line between love and harm, and how quickly it could be crossed when someone let anger replace compassion. For Adrian, already grieving the betrayal of his closest friend, reading Claire's story was another reminder of how easily people you trust can turn into sources of pain. Whether it was Ethan's disregard for loyalty, Thomas's father's careless destruction, or Daniel's descent into aggression, the theme was the same. The people we count on most are sometimes the ones who break us the hardest. The story shifted again, this time to something quieter, but no less heavy in its own way. It came from a young woman named Emily, 21, living on the outskirts of Denver. She wrote about her father, Michael, who was 52. To everyone else, Michael was a rugged man. He worked long hours in construction, he grilled outside every Sunday, he spent weekends fishing at a nearby lake. He was the kind of man people imagined when they thought of strength, endurance, and grit. But behind closed doors, Emily saw another side to him. He loved colorful stone jewelry, intricate rings, even dresses he would quietly point out in shop windows. He never acted on those desires, only confessed them to Emily in hushed tones, almost as though ashamed. Emily adored her father, and more than anything, she wanted him to feel safe being himself. She wondered if there was a way to encourage him, to bridge the gap between what he liked and what he allowed himself to have. People responded with gentle advice. One suggestion was to treat his comments with normalcy. The next time he mentioned wishing he had a reason to buy a dress, she could respond lightly, "Why not buy it for yourself?" Even if he laughed it off, the idea might begin to feel less frightening. Sometimes all a person needs is reassurance that their truth will be met with love, not ridicule. Others suggested small steps, like taking one of the pieces of jewelry he admired and turning it into something subtle like a keychain or a mirror charm. That way he could carry it without fear of judgment, but still feel the quiet joy of having something beautiful that was his. Another person mentioned Halloween, not as a joke, but as a safe opportunity. Dressing up as a female character might let him experience something he had long denied himself, wrapped in the harmlessness of a costume. It could be a gateway to seeing himself in a softer light. Some spoke of role models, of men who openly wore skirts or jewelry, men who weren't defined by traditional masculinity. They suggested introducing Michael to performers and writers who embraced that freedom, showing him he wasn't alone, that the world was wider than the narrow roles he had been forced into as a child. Someone mentioned buying him a jewelry-making kit so that he could create pieces for himself, perhaps finding healing in the act of shaping beauty with his own hands. Emily listened to all of it with an aching heart. She had always known her father as strong, but she now realized how much strength it must take to live every day hiding what you want, silencing a piece of yourself because the world might laugh or judge. He had carried that silence for decades, surrounded by men who would never understand, men who would mock him if he ever dared to show them who he truly was. She wondered how different his life might have been if he had grown up in a place or time where softness wasn't scorned. Adrian, who had been following these stories night after night, felt something stir in him as he read Emily's words. After the betrayals he had endured from Ethan, after watching Thomas wrestle with his father's decline and Claire tremble beneath her husband's rage, this story was different. It wasn't about destruction or betrayal. It was about a quiet longing, a man too afraid to be seen for who he was. Yet even in that gentleness, Adrian saw sadness. To be alive but never fully yourself was its own kind of tragedy. The thread ended with gratitude, Emily thanking those who had taken the time to offer her ideas. She promised she would try to encourage her father little by little, hoping one day he might feel free enough to wear the jewelry he admired without shame. Adrian closed his laptop and sat in silence, the stories still heavy in his chest. They were all different. Friendship shattered by betrayal, a home wrecked by neglect, love poisoned by anger, identity hidden by fear. But beneath them all lay the same quiet ache. Life was filled with people breaking each other, sometimes with violence, sometimes with lies, and sometimes with nothing more than silence. He thought about his own reflection in the dim light of his Denver apartment. How many pieces of himself had he hidden away over the years? How many times had he chosen silence over truth, fear over honesty? He didn't have answers, but he knew this. Every story he read carved its way deeper into him, leaving behind a sorrow that felt familiar. Adrian closed his laptop slowly, the glow from the screen fading as the room settled into silence. Outside, the Denver night pressed against the window, heavy and still, as though the city itself carried the weight of every story he had just read. Ethan's betrayal still lingered, sharp and raw, a reminder of how a decade-long friendship could collapse in a single reckless choice. Thomas's grief over his father's decline hung close too, the image of a wrecked apartment blurring into the deeper heartbreak of watching someone you love unravel before your eyes. Claire's trembling voice echoed in his mind, pleading for help while her husband's anger pushed her into fear. And then Emily's quiet story of her father, Michael, who longed for freedom but remained trapped by a lifetime of judgment, settled into Adrian's heart with a sad gentleness. All of these voices blended together, creating a tapestry of sorrow that Adrian couldn't untangle. They weren't his stories, and yet, in some way, they became part of him. He saw his own scars reflected back, his parents' broken marriage, the shadows of alcohol, the loneliness that followed Ethan's departure. Each tale seemed to whisper the same truth. The people we trust most can bring us both comfort and destruction, and sometimes those closest to us leave the deepest marks. Adrian leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He thought about how easily lives fracture: a lie, a broken boundary, a shove in anger, a truth left unspoken. Each choice cut into someone else, and often the scars remained long after the moment had passed. He wondered how many more people sat in their darkened rooms tonight, carrying burdens they hadn't chosen, searching for voices online that might make them feel less alone. He wished he had answers for them, for Claire, for Thomas, for Emily, even for himself. But all he had was silence. Perhaps silence was its own kind of truth. Not every story found healing. Not every friendship could be repaired. Not every love could be saved. Sometimes survival was the only ending available, and maybe that was enough. Adrian shut off the light, the room sinking into darkness. The city outside kept moving, unaware of the small tragedies unfolding behind closed doors. He lay in bed with the story still circling in his chest, each one leaving him a little heavier, a little sadder, and yet strangely grateful too, for even in heartbreak there was connection. Strangers reaching out across screens, sharing their wounds, reminding him that while pain was lonely, he was never truly alone. Stories like these remind us of the fragile threads that hold our relationships together. Betrayal, neglect, anger, and silence. These are not just random events, but patterns that can destroy trust if we ignore the warning signs. In real life, many people hesitate to act when they first notice small cracks, a partner pushing them aside in anger, a friend disregarding their values, or a parent's behavior shifting in ways that feel off. But those first moments matter. Recognizing them early can mean the difference between years of pain and a chance at healing. If you find yourself in a toxic relationship, whether with a friend, a partner, or even a family member, protecting yourself must come first. Set boundaries clearly, and if they are crossed, do not excuse them away. Seek out support from people who respect you and will stand beside you, because isolation only deepens the hurt. If abuse appears, physical or emotional, know that it is never acceptable, and leaving may be the most powerful act of self-preservation. For those struggling with trauma, remember that healing isn't about forgetting. It's about reclaiming your voice and choosing peace for yourself. Therapy, support groups, and safe communities can make an enormous difference. And when it comes to those we love, compassion matters too. Sometimes the people we see as careless or frustrating may be silently battling illnesses or fears we don't yet understand. The lesson in all of this is simple but vital. Pay attention, trust your instincts, and never be afraid to put your well-being first.